name's Mariam Ali and I'm the Research Coordinator at CAS. And it's our pleasure today to welcome you to the latest CAS event on Islam and the Media Challenges for Society. Speaking to you tonight is the former BBC World Service Middle East analyst Rodger Hardy, who will be exploring whether the media is inherently biased against Islam and Muslims and whether the media is impartial in handling sensitive issues such as sectarianism and related coverage of events such as the Arab Spring. Rodger spent more than 20 years at the World Service after joining the BBC in 1985. He has travelled widely in the Muslim world and has been a visiting fellow at Princeton, the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. and LSE. He is currently a visiting senior research fellow at King's College London, where he is writing a book about the end of empire in the Middle East. His book, The Muslim Revolt, A Journey Through Political Islam, was published in 2010.
Let me begin with a confession. And I speak as someone who's worked in the media for more than 30 years for my sins. I like being a journalist. That's my confession. It's probably good that I like being a journalist because I'm not sure I'm fit for any other work after all these years. I don't regret being a journalist, but I am critical, sometimes highly critical, of what my fellow journalists do. And I suppose I'm especially critical because it's an area of interest to me of coverage of Islam and Muslims. And it was partly that feeling of criticism and also frustration that led me to write a book about Islam and the politics of Islam that came out just about 4 years ago now. And the chapter on Iran turned out in the end to be a chapter on Iran and Shiism. And I think I'd add, just as a prelude to what I want to say to you this evening, after quite a few years as a journalist, it was only in the mid-80s during the Iraq-Iran war that I had my first encounter with Shiism. Really, I knew nothing about Shiism, although I knew something about the Arab world. Mid-80s was the Iran-Iraq war, that was the big story. And in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, I mentioned some of this in the book, we were taken down in coaches to Najaf and Karbala, and this made a big impression on me. And it was only a few years after that that I went to Iran for the first time. What little I know about the Ashura processions and so on, I discovered on the streets of Tehran. And since then, I've tried to get to grips with Shia Islam and redress the balance, redress this clear deficiency in my own education about the Muslim world. I'm going to talk about the news media, and particularly in Britain, but more broadly in the West, and the news media's coverage of Islam and all sorts of issues related to Islam and related to Muslims, wherever Muslims may be. But I want to say a few words first about how the media work, because I think that people outside the media don't understand this very well and have their own sets of preconceptions, possibly even stereotypes. For example, that we're all extremely well paid and that we're rather like sort of Hollywood producers. We have someone to mop the brow and to hand over cups of tea or coffee, if not something stronger, and that we have armies of researchers and fantastic budgets. Would that it were so, but it is not so. Many of my visits to a wide spectrum of countries in the Muslim world I did on my own. Occasionally there'd be a producer accompanying me, they'd just be the two of us. But some of my trips I made entirely on my own. I made all sorts of mistakes. I lacked all sorts of languages. It was about as far removed from Cecil B. DeMille as it's possible to be. There's a phrase by Kate Adie, the veteran BBC correspondent that I'm fond of. She describes a big media organization, not unlike the BBC, in rather unflattering terms. She calls such an organization a machine that absorbs and then spits out the matters of the moment. It's not a very beautiful image, but I think for any of us who've worked for a big media organization, it rings true. This is the media machine. And also, the words she's chosen reflect the two main tasks. I often think it's a bit like the fishermen. They're the guys who go out and catch the fish, or in this case, the news. And then they're the people who process what's been caught. They either chop up the fish and sell it as is, or stick it in tins and sell it for a rainy day. So there's the news gathering part, and there's the news dissemination part. And she describes this really rather unlovely, possibly rather Heath Robinson machine that does this process of absorbing and spitting out. Once you get into the innards of the machine, you see not only the possibilities, but what always strikes me, and I think doesn't necessarily strike people outside the media, are the limitations of what you can do. Yes, the possibilities of what you can do. Potentially you can reach huge audiences. I was a radio man, but the last few years of my career I was working a lot online. But as to the limitations, I try to sum them up as being the three tyrannies, which is a little bit like one of those Chinese curses. The first tyranny is the tyranny of the deadline. Journalists work under pressure, often under intense pressure. To give you a tiny glimpse of what I used to do, I used to go into Bush House, where sadly the World Service is not there anymore, but throughout my 24 years, that was the place where I worked. The hour between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. was the golden hour where I tried to figure out what was happening in the world and therefore what I might be writing that day. But I'd go to the key meeting, the 9 o'clock meeting, and they'd tell me what they wanted me to do that day. I'd come out of that meeting at 9:30, and I would very often be told to write a piece for the 11 o'clock bulletin. Think about it. 9:30 to 11 o'clock. And this didn't mean that you turn up with your piece of paper at 1 minute to 11. No, your piece is written, approved, or at least glanced at by somebody else if it needed that, pre-recorded, because that's the norm, in time, so that they would then say, right, we've got our order. An hour and a half, you'd have sometimes an hour to write that piece. And I was the Middle East analyst. I was supposed to say something wise, something that would explain, something that would make sense of an item that was in the news. As I used to tell the trainees at Bush House, you don't have a lot of time to ring your granny or consult the Encyclopedia Britannica. These are the facts of life for the news journalist. So there's the tyranny of the deadline, from which there's no escape, the tyranny of the clock, if you like. Then there's the tyranny of the image, and I mean literally what nowadays is either the online, the internet image, or the television image. As people in the media say, it's become a cliche, no picture, no story. And if you want an Iraqi example of this, think of the aftermath, the grim aftermath after Saddam had invaded Kuwait. Compare the situation of the Kurds, you remember, fleeing north from northern Iraq. Compare the situation of the Kurds as reflected in the media and the situation of the Shia in the south, particularly the Marsh Arabs. It's very simple in media terms. The Kurds were visible and the Shia of the south were largely invisible. For those of you who know, the Al-Khoury Foundation tried to do something about this, and Michael Wood made a film. And good for him that he tried to do this. No picture, no story. The Kurds were there streaming out towards Turkey, and there were the pictures, and it was a strong story. No picture, no story. But the third tyranny is in some ways, in my view, the most insidious of them all. And let's call it, for working purposes, the tyranny of the narrative, the frame that journalists use, rather like the frame of a picture. And a common element of this narrative is the need to have good guys and bad guys. Now, part of this I sympathize with. I've been there. I've done this. I always say to people, I'm in the simplification business. There's no choice about that. And the question is whether I simplify and clarify or whether I simplify and distort. So the difference between the good journalist and the bad journalist is I clarify and he distorts, if you pardon my vanity. So journalists have to simplify complex stories. But the risk is that we oversimplify and we turn a complex reality into a couple of sound bites, or a frame that's too neat, that we push the story into good guys and bad guys, when that really doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Let me turn now to the substance of what I want to say, and I'll talk about coverage of Islam in general terms and some of what seem to me the obvious weaknesses, deficiencies, outright prejudices, and then, as you heard from Mariam, I'll take as kind of case studies, not very detailed ones, but the issue of sectarianism, coverage of sectarianism, and then coverage of the Arab Spring, and then I'll try to draw a few conclusions. My starting point is this, that journalists tend to share the views and prejudices of the societies in which they live and work. Of course, journalists are supposed to be in some way detached from those societies by the nature of their work, if they're professional in what they're doing. We're supposed to be objective, which presupposes a degree of distance between us and our subject matter. But even if we're professional, we're also human. I like to say journalists are human despite all evidence to the contrary. We're human in the sense that we carry the baggage that all of us have because of who we are, where we live, how we were educated, everything. Now, one specific aspect of this, let's think about Britain. In Britain, journalists, like the general population, and this is certainly true in my experience, are for the most part secular. And by secular, I mean they sit on a spectrum of views that may spread from an indifference, let's call it a fairly benign indifference, a kind of neutral indifference on the one end of the spectrum to outright hostility on the other. So secular in a spectrum of possible meanings. Few journalists, very few in my experience, are committed to one particular faith or another, and have a certain cynicism towards religion and towards the people who have a faith of one kind or another. I know I'm in danger of generalizing here, but broadly speaking, especially if we keep this spectrum in mind, I think broadly speaking that's true, and it's been true in my experience. One example that really surprised me at the time, when a BBC colleague got the job of religious affairs correspondent, he's still a distinguished journalist today, I think I won't name him, other journalists came up to him to commiserate. They felt sorry for him, as if he'd got the short straw. Oh, poor guy, you're dealing with religion. As it happens, he was smarter than they were and knew that religion, in all sorts of aspects, religious, social, political, you name it, was a huge issue now, and he did a very good job. But this attitude from his colleagues I found very revealing. The problem goes well beyond this general secular character of society. I think it's embedded in this. This is part of the ground. But where, if we talk about Islamophobia, as I want to do now, I always want to ask, what do we mean by this term? And insofar as we can tell, where does it come from? The notion that it's a virus in the air and that you sort of catch it, if you live in a Western predominantly secular society, I don't find this terribly persuasive. I don't see it as a virus. I see it as a set of cultural and social norms, if you like, which influence journalists. This sense that I have that journalists are part of their societies. How far they're leading the societies, how far they're being led by popular opinion is something that we could debate. But there's some kind of interplay there. As long ago as 1997, the Runnymede Trust, and I fished it out, produced their groundbreaking report, Islamophobia, A Challenge for Us All. Much of it's still valid today, but at the time, unique. None of us could think of any society, Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, where anybody had attempted this kind of critique. And let's be clear, it was a critique of the society as well as the media. Media have a huge part in this, and there's a whole section on cartoons, which is fascinating, and they try to anatomize what this thing, Islamophobia, actually is. But it was an indictment, and nobody had made such an indictment about such a society. Well, what do we mean by Islamophobia? You can have a phobia of spiders or whatever, and it's a mixture or flying, or your vertigo, or of being mugged in the streets, and it's a mixture essentially of fear and hatred. And this was the view posited by the authors of the report, and often in my experience posited by many Muslims who read this report and said, you see, finally someone's saying what we've been saying all these years. We've lived this, but now these people, the great and the good, as we say in Britain, have come together, Christians, Muslims and Jews, and in a very well-written, cogent report have said what we Muslims have known and felt and experienced for years and years and years. To which my comment is, yes, fear and hatred, but if this is a cocktail, there's a third, there's something else going on here. I don't believe this is hatred pure and simple, if there is such a thing as hatred pure and simple. I don't think this is fear pure and simple. I think this is fear, hatred, and ignorance in an unequal mix. It's not that there are fixed parts to this cocktail and everybody sort of imbibes the cocktail, not at all. The mix will vary from one human being to another, and then naturally enough from one journalist to another, or one media organization, if the media organization has some kind of pronounced view about Islam and Muslims. It may, or it may not. Some tend to. The Daily Telegraph, for a while, was the leading Islamophobic newspaper. Charles Moore had what I would call a tinge of guilt, talked to the Prince of Wales and ran a report with a preface by the Prince of Wales and a number of pieces by my friend Malise Riven, and it was clearly an attempt to balance or counter the image that they'd acquired as being a paper that disliked Islam and Muslims. Why do I stress the ignorance? Because in my experience, journalists know very little about Islam and Muslims. I'm trying to describe to you the average journalist, not the person who is paid to know something about the Middle East or about the Muslim world or the specialists. Your average journalist who may well be writing about this in a newspaper, on a website, or making a TV program, or being a TV presenter in some shape or form. What is it that we get wrong, essentially? And this is where I'm broad brush, and I leave it to the discussion. You can elaborate on this, challenge me as you wish. I hope you will. I think the main mistakes that we make too many, first of all, we make too many generalizations about Muslims. One of the worst mistakes is the sense that Islam is all the same, Muslims are all the same. Doesn't matter if they're in Morocco, if they're in Indonesia, or they're in Britain or in France. But worse than that, they're all the same, and they're all rather like the Taliban. They all chop off hands, they all hate women, they hate Israel, they hate the West. If not the Taliban, then they're all like the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia. Now, for anyone who knows anything about Islam, this is grotesque. But believe me, this is fairly widely held view in British society, and I found the same pretty much true in the United States when I lived there for a while. We make too many sweeping generalizations that frequently fall apart when you really try to scrutinize them. We Arabize Islam. We somehow conflate Arabs and Muslims, either forgetting or else totally unaware that most Muslims today live east of the Middle East. We don't reflect the tremendous variety of the Muslim world. In all my travels, I never ceased to be amazed at the incredible variety of the Muslim Ummah. If I stopped, if I became complacent for a while and thought, no, well, I know something about Islam, I'm thinking about writing a book, I'd be sent off to Indonesia or somewhere and think, wow. And after thinking, wow, I'd think, why does this feel different? Why does Islam feel different in Indonesia than it does in Egypt or in Turkey? And it's not a straightforward question to answer, but there are possible answers to do. Not rocket science, I think, to do with history, geography, political culture, you know, because they've come from there. Yes, they have the commonality of Islam, but their experience has been totally different from the experience of other Muslims in totally different other places. We don't reflect this huge variety of the Ummah, preferring, and I'm speaking now about lazy journalism, but I'm afraid it's fairly common, preferring the easy stereotypes once summed up as bombers, billionaires, and belly dancers. It's a phrase, it was the title of a book actually written by Jack Shaheen, an Arab American, about Arabs, but you can use this, I think, today fairly accurately to describe the stereotypes about Muslims. Either bombers, super violent, billionaires, super rich, or belly dancers, super sexy. And this is, of course, Orientalism. This is absolutely Orientalism as described and anatomized by Edward Said. Let me add one other dimension to this, and then I'll come to the Arab Spring and the issue of sectarianism. All of what I've been saying so far could apply to the Middle East or the Muslim world, you know, beyond our shores. But now, of course, nowadays, Islam is both a domestic story for journalists. It's a British story and it's a European story. It's close to us geographically, physically, as well as being a foreign story, a foreign affairs, foreign policy story. And if you think only for a moment of all those crises and controversies over the last 20 or 25 years, the Rushdie affair, the headscarf controversy, or controversies really, the whole series of controversies, the Danish cartoons, the incidents of violence, the Madrid bombing, the 7/7 bombings in London. The cumulative effect of all these incidents in Europe, they had made in Europe written on them. They were specifically European stories, even when they had resonance, as was inevitably the case. They were made in Europe stories. The cumulative effect has been to create a considerable degree of tension and polarization in our societies between us and them, between Muslims and non-Muslims. One result, I'll mention only one of the dark side effects of all this, is the widespread view in Western Europe as a whole, including Britain, I think, that it's more or less impossible for Muslims to integrate into a Western society. How can you integrate? How can Muslims be expected to integrate if they burn books, if they insist on wearing their headscarves even when there's a public policy that the girls should not wear them, if they don't accept freedom of speech to the point where they can accept a few, what was the phrase used by the Economist, a few childish cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. You know, what's wrong with these people? And they obviously can't integrate into the kind of society. This is the view. It was widespread during the time of when these crises were very hot, and I suspect it's very very true today. Think of Angela Merkel. I think it was last year, perhaps a year ago, she stood up and said and announced the death in Germany of multiculti, as they call it, the rather nice phrase that they have for multiculturalism. Everybody, the British, the Dutch, and then the Germans were saying multiculturalism is dead. And often multiculturalism was a code word meaning principally Muslims. Maybe not only, but where are the problem children of integration now? Who are the perceived problem children in Britain, France, the Netherlands, and so on? Muslims. Incidentally, let me hasten to say this view that Muslims you can't possibly integrate seems to me a total myth, not supported by any body of scholarship that I am aware of. In fact, the scholars who've really gone out and looked at this in France, in Western Europe, reach the opposite conclusion. Not uniformly, but what I consider the respectable scholarship. People like Jutta Clausen, who's the guy who wrote Integrating Islam, a book about France. These people do serious research, and they say that integration is actually happening, despite the myth, much beloved by the media, that it is not happening and that it cannot happen. I mentioned the importance of the narrative, the role of the narrative in journalism, the frame in which journalists situate a particular story, and to some extent are encouraged by their editors to frame the story. And a good example of this is the Arab Spring. If you think of the exciting revolutionary days of the Arab Spring, this gave journalists, Western journalists, a simple and really very appealing narrative of good guys and bad guys. Youthful protesters rising up against evil dictators. Dramatic story, Tahrir Square. It doesn't get any better. And the media really went for it. In fact, it's possible to criticize at least a handful of Western journalists, not only in Egypt, but then later on in the uprising in Libya against Gaddafi, for getting carried away and becoming, in effect, cheerleaders for the revolution. I'm not sure I have it in me to entirely blame them, but nevertheless, the professional part of me would say, hang on a minute here. Let the story speak for itself. Your listeners, your viewers, your readers, if you're online, will be able to identify with no difficulty whatsoever for these young protesters. You don't need to go over the top. This displays my BBC background. As my wife would say if she was here, you can take the man out of the BBC, but you can't take the BBC out of the man. But my view would be you didn't need to become a cheerleader. You tell the story, and it was a dramatic and exciting story. But of course, it didn't last like that. And I'm certainly not saying that that has characterized the overall coverage of the Arab Spring over these last 3 years or so, not at all. As we know, as time went on, the whole story of the Arab Spring, if indeed we can call it the story of the Arab Spring, because it broke down into its constituent parts in many ways, but the whole story, if we can use that term, first became more complicated, became harder for the journalists to explain. They didn't have this easy narrative to fall back on. And in the case of Syria, became considerably more dangerous to cover. And in that context, some of the coverage of the Arab Spring has been heroic. To name only two journalists, Mary Colvin was a direct victim of the Syria conflict, and some of you may have read Anthony Shadid of the Washington Post, who was a kind of indirect victim. He wasn't killed by shelling, but he was on his way out of Syria and tragically died. Two fine journalists in my estimation. But if there's been this heroic aspect to some of the coverage, there have also been real weaknesses too, which seem to me to typify some of the problems I'm trying to identify. A failure to dig deeper into the causes and consequences of the uprisings. A failure to stick with the story. How many of the journalists stuck with Syria after the exciting beginning when Bouazizi set fire to himself? How many even bothered to go back on election day? Usually, especially television, they like an election because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can do it in a day. Here they come, putting their mark or their sign, and will they vote for this one? You know, it's a bit like a race. There's supposed to be a winner and so on. Where do you find good coverage of what's happened to Tunisia nowadays? In English, let's say, not in French, not in Arabic. And the answer is it's very hard to find good information about Tunisia. Still, arguably, let me be cautious here, potentially the success story of the Arab Spring. Certainly a country that's in a much better place than, say, Egypt is today. And the other weakness, which will lead me on to some other comments, would lead me on to the issue of sectarianism. A failure by the media, with the partial exception of Bahrain, a failure to cover the Arab monarchies as fully as the Arab republics. The view got around that the republics were in trouble and that somehow the monarchies were not in trouble. If you haven't seen it, I was reading it on the tube today, Sectarian Gulf by Toby Mattison, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab Spring that wasn't. In other words, the Arab Spring that, as far as the Gulf, the Arab side of the Gulf is concerned. It's an excellent book, and it tells you things that you won't find in the media. In fact, I will read you just a few lines from what he says about Saudi Arabia, and he mentions the media. Since 2011, Saudi Arabia has seen the largest street protests the country has ever known. Most dissent came from Shia Muslims in the eastern province, but there were small protests, petitions, and criticisms of the ruling family in various other parts of the kingdom. The repression of protests led to the death of at least 15 Shia youths. Western media and the Arab media controlled by Gulf rulers have stayed largely silent, partly because the Saudi government prevents journalists and researchers from traveling to the eastern province. Occasionally, a good researcher can compensate for some of the deficiencies of the media, but only up to a point. You know, how many people will read Toby's book compared with those who go to bbc.news.uk? Not many, I think, by comparison. So the mention of the Gulf, mention of Saudi Arabia, mention of leads me fairly naturally to the issue of sectarianism, which I know is an issue that concerns many of you. And let me say at the outset, my view on this may seem rather simple to some of you. And if I had to put it very boldly, I would say those journalists who, or commentators who are often the worst, including politicians who choose to write in op-ed columns from time to time, if they don't like Muslims, they don't really care very much if they're Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims, and they may not even know enough to know the difference. They're just Muslims. And they're instinctively suspicious of them or hostile to them. I'm not saying by that sectarianism doesn't matter. I'm trying to get a sense of Western perceptions of sectarianism, in particular the perceptions of journalists. In my view, the average journalist, just like the average man or woman on the street, or for that matter, the average politician, doesn't know much about Sunni and Shia. I wonder if any of you saw, there was a real Hollywood B movie, and the climax comes on a mountainside, and the real evil guy, I think he's an American senator, comes down from his helicopter, and he gives sort of lecture to all the guys on this mountaintop. And I was struck by the addition of a phrase that you would not have got from Hollywood 20 years ago or even 15 years ago. Don't imagine, guys, that the world is divided into Republicans and Democrats, or Sunnis and Shia. It's divided between the guys with the guns and the guys with no guns. Now, I was struck, why did some scriptwriter add these Sunnis and Shias? And the answer is they wanted to show how up to the minute they were, how that they, you know, they didn't know much about Sunnis, they didn't know much about Shias, but they knew that there was a kind of talk about it, there was a buzz about Sunnis and Shias. But if you ask the average Briton about Shiism, they'll almost certainly think of Iranians chanting death to America, death to Israel. They might remember Muqtada al-Sadr and the Mahdi army in Iraq, or they'll think of Hezbollah fighters marching defiantly through the streets of Beirut. When it comes to sectarianism now, meaning Sunni Shia sectarianism, I think journalists are not starting with an entirely blank page. They're not starting, as I've said, with a great deal of knowledge. But they come to the issue, for example, through the prism of Northern Ireland. So they have some perception that religion is exploitable, that religion and politics can get mixed up, and political actors of one kind or another find religion a very handy thing to exploit, often leading to sectarian tension. So it's not an entirely novel idea. In other words, following this notion of it being exploited and being exploitable, I think there's a perception, sometimes a rather dim perception, that sectarianism is often top-down rather than being a genuinely grassroots phenomenon and, you know, bottom-up. And to me, this is at least a more enlightened way of seeing sectarianism. This was the rule of thumb I developed when we had some really sensitive stories to cover involving Iraq or Bahrain or Pakistan or Lebanon. And I would usually sit down and try to figure out who is gaining from this, who is trying to exploit Sunni Shia tension and for what end. Not always difficult to find the answer to that question, but it was a good question to be trying to ask and to get a discussion going, get a debate going in some of the longer programs that had space to do that. So if it's top-down rather than bottom-up, that means that someone somewhere is exploiting it, either from inside that country or from outside that country. That's what I call the somewhat more enlightened view, that you try to see what's really going on here behind the rhetoric, behind the labels, and behind the violence. The decidedly less enlightened view is that of, for example, Norman Tebbit, who commented on Iraq that once Saddam Hussein was out of the way, Sunnis and Shia went back to killing one another as they had for hundreds of years. That's pretty grotesque. That's the other side of that spectrum. No, it's not being manipulated from outside. These guys are just, if you've pardoned the expression, are just dying to kill one another. Saddam sat on them like a great boulder because he was a dictator. Remove the boulder and they'll resume the president. It's grotesque. But why do I mention this in a talk about the media in the Middle East? I think that there are journalists and commentators who essentially share the view of Norman Tebbit, even if they wouldn't necessarily put it in quite such plain terms. But I think, fortunately, journalists' attitudes are not uniform. And the other thing I want to say about sectarianism is that, in my experience, the attitude of the journalist depends to quite a large extent on the context. Let's take Bahrain. During the uprising in Bahrain, journalists, without much difficulty, tended to identify with the protesters, who happened to be largely Shia, because, for one thing, because the Shia are the largest component of the Bahraini population. And it was not easy to identify with a regime that was suppressing pretty harshly those protesters. And again, the memory of Tahrir Square was there. Remember? Good guys and bad guys. Protesters wanting individual freedoms, with other things maybe. The slogans would vary somewhat from country to country, as opposed to a regime. yes, an ally of Britain, an ally of the West. Most journalists could get that far, they could see that. But that was really behaving very badly. That was the context. I suspect that the average journalist, whether they go to Saudi Arabia or not, or whether, like me, they struggle to get visas and manage to go, I think, 4 or 5 times in my career, they tend not to like Saudi Arabia very much, which means they are somewhat open to the notion of writing a story with some degree of implicit sympathy. I'm sorry, I'm choosing my words with some care. Some degree of implicit sympathy for people, for persecuted non-Wahhabis. In the current context, that would be the Shia, the extract I read from Toby Mattison's book, or it could be the Sufis or other minorities, religious minorities in Saudi Arabia. I don't think, let me put it the other way around, I don't think journalists are somehow programmed or predisposed to feeling that it's a good thing for Saudi Arabia to repress its religious minorities. I don't see any sign of this. Do journalists understand Saudi Arabia very well? No, they don't. And after my 4 or 5 visits, I don't think I understand it very well either. Maybe I understand my own ignorance a bit better. So that's one kind of context. But now, and if this provokes some discussion from you, I welcome that. There are contexts in which the Shia are not obviously the underdog. If it's Iran, the Shiite mullahs of Iran, suppressing the Green movement back, when was it, 2009, the boot is, as it were, on the other foot. Now, you may say these are Shia repressing Shia. I'm saying, how do journalists respond? In one context, Bahrain, it's a very different response from Iran. And then the really tricky issue, the big, nasty, overwhelming issue of today is Syria. And where Iran, to the extent that Iran and Shia groups, especially Hezbollah, are supporting the Assad regime in Syria, this will tend to provoke a critical reaction from the media as from the general society. Of course, for those who try to look at Iran, look at Hezbollah, they have their own reasons for supporting the Assad regime in Damascus. But my point is that for the majority of people in Britain, that means support for a brutal dictatorship. You see, I hope you see what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to look at the context in which Sunni and Shia appear. It's not always the same. I've gone on for quite a long time, and I want to draw a few conclusions, not entirely negative ones, because I don't feel entirely negative about this. I'm negative to the extent that, as I hope I've made clear by now, we have a problem. Media coverage of these issues lacks balance and impartiality. That's a bad problem in and of itself, but it has a host of negative consequences, not just for British foreign policy, if we stick with Britain as the example for the moment, but for the cohesion and well-being of our own society. If Islam and Muslims are routinely misunderstood, demonized, misrepresented in the media, this does not have a beneficial impact on the development of a tolerant, decent, multicultural society, quite the opposite. We have a problem, and the main point I want to make in concluding is that it seems to me it's up to Muslims and non-Muslims alike to try to solve it. Muslims can't solve this problem on their own, but non-Muslims can't solve this problem on their own either. We have a problem. I think there's been some improvement, I stress some improvement, in the situation over the last few years. I'll say briefly why I think that. Parts of the media, The Guardian, Channel 4, quite a few bits of the BBC, are less prone to Islamophobia, if I can put this negatively, are less prone to Islamophobia than other parts of the media. And quite a different factor, there are now clearly more Muslims working in the media, as well as more Muslims, by which I mean the mainstream media, as well as more Muslims writing blogs and Facebook pages, contributing to all sorts of websites. But after saying those two things about some degree of improvement over the last few years, it seems to me absolutely evident that much more needs to be done. And let me try and put it very simply. The media need to do what they claim they're already doing, which is to be fair. The question is not, in my judgment, to try and turn an anti-Islam media into a pro-Islam media. The BBC would say, and I would have endorsed this when I was working for them, and I would endorse it now, I'm not pro-Blair and I'm not anti-Blair, I'm fair. I tell it as it is, and that's what I think Muslims should go for. And they should be then knocking on an open door, because even the worst of the tabloids, even Fox News, they tend to say they're fair and objective and impartial. The aim is to get them, to put them on the spot, say, you say you're being fair, so why do you do this, why do you do that? Don't expect them to love you. Expect them to be fair. Hold them to the yardstick that they themselves set for themselves. I hope I'm not misunderstood here. And as for Muslims, in my view, and this is beginning to happen, Muslims need to engage with the media rather than just complaining about the media. Who should be doing this? This can be done clearly by mosques and Muslim organizations, but it can also be done by individuals. I don't say this is easy, but I do say that this is possible. And if they take up this challenge, Muslims really can make a difference. Thank you very much.